Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today is Friday morning, March 20th. Today we are going to talk about imperialism in Africa. So yesterday I explained to you what imperialism means, okay? So today we're going to talk about how did it go down in the continent of Africa. On Tuesday I gave you a map assignment. I want you to think back to that assignment and where did Europeans want to colonize first on the African continent? They colonized around the coast, right? Because there's easier access to Europe on the oceans and on the seas. All right, so today, what I want you to think about and keep in the back of your mind is this. How did European powers claim control over most of the African continent by the end of the 1800s? Meaning there will only be two independent African nations by the end of the century, and we're going to talk about both of them today. First is the effects of Islam on the African continent. The first thing you need to know is by the time the 1800s come around, the nation known as Pavo, or as we call Turkey today, or back then, the Ottoman Empire, was starting to lose power in Africa, the Middle East, Southeastern Europe, okay? However, Islam continued to spread. It brought strong governments that led to less corruption. There were higher literacy rates among the people of Africa. There was peace and there was increased trade, okay? So Africa was going through many changes before imperialism. There was one, the Ottoman Empire was declining, it was losing its power. In West Africa, basically the area known as Nigeria today and Mauritania, Islam was gaining power. Okay, in the eastern part of Africa, slavery was starting to increase. So slavery had always been across the Atlantic. As European nations are starting to ban slavery, slaves are going to start being sent to the Middle East, mainly what is now known as Saudi Arabia. And finally, in the southern part of the continent, the Zulus and the Boers, who we learned about earlier last week, did battle with each other. So, I want to talk about one of the nations that was independent throughout the whole century, Liberia. Liberia is a nation in Western Africa. It was settled by freed American slaves in 1822. In 1847, Liberia is going to become an independent nation, and they're going to decide to do everything the same exact way the Americans did. With a constitution, Declaration of Independence, all that other good stuff. Liberia will never be colonized by any European nation. Okay, they're going to be one of two, again, that will never be colonized. Locals, however, are going to view the freed slaves as the imperialists, okay? Because basically the freed slaves are going to take their African American traditions and bring them to Africa, and the African people will be like, wait, this isn't our culture. So there's going to be a lot of problems, a lot of strife. Another issue is that the freed slaves are going to make English the official language, and many of the local natives don't speak English. So that's going to be a huge issue. And there will actually be a civil war from 1987 to 2005. Liberia then became the first African nation to elect a woman as their president. I got a little bit hungry, so I'm going to be making soup a la Stuart from a can. All right, so while I'm cooking, I'm going to continue to talk to you guys a little bit about Africa. All right, so I want you to think back to the beginning of the year when we learned about all the explorers, Henry the Navigator, Da Gama, all those other great guys that I'm sure none of you ever forgot. When we think back, all the colonies that the Europeans settled were built on the coast, okay? They were all along the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, or the Mediterranean Sea. Let me just turn this on, and there we go. Oh, it's going to be so good. All right. So, back to the 1800s. I'm sure you have heard about Livingston and Stanley, Dr. Livingston and Henry Stanley. If you haven't, that's because you haven't been keeping up with your reading or listening to me. All right, so Dr. Livingston was a doctor, okay? He wanted to open up Africa to Christianity and trade. Why? Because he hated slavery. He thought slavery was the worst thing in the world, in that if we would make these people Christian and trade with them, that there'd be no more slavery. All right? He spent 30 years living in the African continent. He was found by Henry Stanley, who was a foreign correspondent, which is a type of journalist that is sent to other countries to basically report on the news in those countries. All right, so I'm going to stir the soup a little bit, make sure that it's nice and mixed in. And if I can make 2 recommendations that everyone should have in their kitchen. The first, Old Bay seasoning. It's delicious. I put this on my crabs, on my fries, on my mac and cheese, really on everything. The other, Cafe Bustelo. When you need that extra kick, have some Cafe Bustelo and you'll have so much energy. All right, back to Africa. The Europeans used their medical advances, they used steamships. These allowed missionaries and traders and other explorers to reach into the heart of the African continent. When you are in college or a senior in high school, you might read Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Great book, talks a lot about the African continent. Now I want to talk to you about the pros and cons of imperialism. The first advantage was that it brought medicine to the African continent. Now, people living there were able to be treated with Western medicine, and this started to increase the lifespan. Second, it brought formal education to the African continent, kind of like what we have here today in the United States. And third, this really did a lot to end the slave trade in Africa. Okay? However, there were a lot of negatives to imperialism. Some of the negatives to imperialism was one, that it ended self-determination, meaning the people of Africa had no say over how they lived or what their laws were going to be. Second, it completely destroyed traditional societies. Now the people living in Africa were expected to adopt Western traditions instead of their own traditions. Third, people were exploited. They lost land, they lost property, they lost life, and these people were never fairly compensated for everything that they lost. And that's going to lead to a lot of problems even after the Europeans leave in the 1960s. Now, I want to show you another life hack. Sometimes your Progresso soup doesn't have the best noodles. However, you can add some Rouse noodles. Let's add some noodles to this. Yum, yum, yum. Yum, yum, yum. Oop, we got a little piece of chicken in the chicken soup. Yum, yum, yum. Oh, and voila. Now the chicken a la Stuart just needs to cook a little more. In addition to using Old Bay on crabs, macaroni and cheese, and French fries, you can also use it on shrimp or on chicken. Just mix it in with some vinegar and some parsley and you have a delicious meal. Also, sometimes you need to use your fork to eat your soup because the noodles might be too big for your spoon. Life hack. Now, a few things about Africa I want to go over. The first is I want you to think about the country of Belgium, right? We think of Belgium, great soccer players, they love ice cream, they love waffles, they love chocolate, they're so good at that. Well, they weren't good for the people of Congo. I'm going to read a quote to you by King Leopold II. He was the king of Belgium in the 1800s. Basically, he said that because of what he was doing for millions of men still plunged in barbarism, they will be, basically, they will have the dawn of a better era. That times will be better for them. He was saying that he was going to Congo to bring better times. Now, if you paid attention yesterday, you would have learned the reasons for imperialism were economic, political, humanitarian, religious, and social Darwinism. The soup is really good, but I think I might need to add some of this in there. Back to King Leopold. King Leopold wanted to use Congo for rubber. Rubber is used to make tires. He felt that he could get very rich by exploiting Congo for its rubber. What happened was he would ask the people of Congo to basically pay their taxes in rubber. So each person of Congo was responsible for providing rubber. If they couldn't, no more hands. They would chop their hands off as a punishment. What's going to happen is the Belgian government is going to find out about this. They're not going to be happy, and they're actually going to tell King Leopold, you don't have Belgium anymore. I know you're our king, but you can't have this anymore. We're taking it away from you. The Europeans basically wanted a place in the sun. Okay, basically they wanted the prestige and power that came with owning a continent, with owning a colony. They're going to have something called the Berlin Conference, where the European powers are going to get together and they're going to decide how they're going to split up Africa and the rules that they're going to use to govern it. How many Africans do you think were invited to this conference? I'll wait. If you guess 0, then ding, 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 you have the right answer. 0 Africans were invited to this conference. I also want to talk to you about a guy named Cecil Rhodes, who you may have come across. Cecil Rhodes was a rich British man. He used his influence and his money to help Britain colonize Africa, and as a sign of thanks, they named a colony after him, Rhodesia, which today is now the independent nation of Zimbabwe. Alright, so I want to introduce to you a vocabulary word, domain. So domains are established one of 3 ways: via wars, through treaties, or through alliances. Let's talk about the African elite. So when we covered the French Revolution, we learned about the first and second estates in France. Africa had their own version of the elite, which were really the upper class and middle classes who decided to westernize. This is important because the British will allow these people to rule their own colonies, okay? Whereas the French put French people in charge of the colonies. These elites will eventually lead the African independence movement. So when a lot of the African nations start to get their independence in the 1960s, it will be these elites who will lead them because they're familiar with democracy and how Europeans think. How did Africans resist imperialism? Well, 1, they modernized. 2, they westernized. Or 3, they fought back. A great example is the other independent African nation, Ethiopia. Ethiopia was able to survive because they westernized, they modernized, and then they fought back, and they actually defeated the Italians at the Battle of Adwa in the 1800s. Alright, so when we started off today, I'd ask you, how were the Europeans able to colonize Africa? Well, the explorers, the missionaries were able to penetrate or get into Africa. They were able to get into the interior, okay, and then the Europeans divided the African people, and then they conquered with superior weaponry. That is Africa, my good people. On Monday I will be back, and we will talk about imperialism in the Middle East. Have a great weekend, and I can't wait to see you soon.